Good morning, everybody. I think we should start so we have time for discussion. Hopefully some other people will stroll in. So my name is Elizabeth Politzer. I have assembled this lovely panel. They will tell you a lot of very interesting things. But before, I would like just to give you kind of a rapid immersion into what gender in research actually means. So this session is about widespread manifestations and important consequences of gender bias in science. And let's just start here. The important issues is in participation. So the first figure, everybody knows, the leaky pipeline, the scissors figures. More women enter universities than men, but 80% of professors are men. So there's an issue there. What happens to the women along the way? The figure next to it, the one with the bars, this one shows the participation of women and men in research teams. Just concentrate on the blue and the red ones. The red ones are the men. The blue ones are the women. So in every field, life sciences, physical and engineering sciences, the middle group, and social sciences and humanities, the last group, you can see that as the seniority of members of the team increases, the number of women decreases. So women are being excluded from important research. This data is for a European Research Council, which funds only excellent research. To be part of a team, ERC team, is really as an entry point to very important networks and career opportunities. At the lower level, the first figure is about success rates in getting grants from European Research Council. Above is the success rates of men. Below are the success rates of women. So you can see systematically over the period of years, men are more successful in getting grants. Now, getting prestigious grants is really very important. Not being as successful as men is really very punishing for women's careers. And then there's a great deal of talk today about implicit and bias, unconscious bias. Well, actually, a lot of that bias is very conscious and complicit. So there was a report from Japan medical school that consistently over the years graded women entering medical school lower than men because they were worried that all the women might get pregnant or, and abandon medicine, and so they like to keep the level of female-male participation in medical school at 30% for women. So what are the consequences of it? Of course, there are consequences for the women. Are there consequences for science? So when we look at it from the scientific point of view, basically looking at the research process, at every step of the research process, there is a gender bias that favors men or males. So studies would normally include more males than females as subjects. They will either report or not report what the sex of the subject was. Historically, this has been a very persistent problem, and it partly contributes to the fact that between 50 to 80% of published results are not replicable. So in the US, $28 billion is funded for preclinical research that is not reproducible. So basically the argument is that if science ignores the fact that sex and gender could be a very important variable in research, the research results are basically not valid. So, but there is now emerging new practice the people are realizing that actually you have to look at the possibility that sex and gender impacts on quality of results. And this is just the one paper that was published in Nature very recently. So the problem is that if you have a bias in research, so basically we don't know whether the results are as good for women as for men, or that they are actually better for men because the it was the male that was included as the norm, then of course that knowledge goes into the innovation and we get a bias in innovation. And there are many, many, many examples. The issue is that actually most frequently the effectiveness of this innovation is worse for women because the data, there's much science today has got much more data for men. And here's one example, okay, sex-blind lab-on-a-chip technologies. Lab-on-a-chip technologies use cells or tissues to model their effects, say toxicity on living matter. So lab-on-a-chip technologies are a good idea because they replace animal studies, but most of these studies do not report or do not consider the sex of the cells that are used in the studies. And therefore, we don't know if the results from these studies are going to be better for women or for men. Basically, they will replicate the gaps in knowledge for women. And one interesting thing that was recently reported was that the suppliers of commercial suppliers of cell lines for research do not know what sex their cells are. So if you're a researcher, you need some cells to do experiments, or make an order, cells arrive, you don't know are they male, female, or both. So the consequences are, one of consequences is that 8 out of 10 prescription drugs that were withdrawn from the market in the USA between 1997 and 2000, 8 out of those 10 prescription drugs were more dangerous for women than for men. So if it costs about $1 billion to produce a prescription drug, that is also an important economic consequence. This is another example. There's been a great increase in the use of ionizing radiation for medical diagnosis. Much more now than it was about 20 years ago. The models that are used for dosimetry are based on a male body, the reference man, and therefore they are not really accounting for the differences in the density of tissue, etc., for women. The women, and especially girls, have a much greater risk of cancer than from exposure to ionizing radiation than boys and men. And yet the figure with this green and yellow things, this is from a project, European project that is looking at the new novel ways of using ionizing radiation and the interactions with matter. Although they have sort of aspects there to deal with biology, they have not included consideration of the differences between the sexes. So basically, it's again, we're going to come up with new technologies that do not actually represent the accurate measures for women and men. This is another one about where the ignorance of the importance of this, biological differences and gender differences matters. A lot of sensors are being used for wearables. They measure physiological characteristics. And in that list below there are all those characteristics that are used to measure physiological state. In all of those, there are differences between women and men that are not considered in the design of those sensors. And then it's now quite clear that the expression, gene expression in different chromosomes differs between the tissues and between women and men. Again, this is not included in the modeling of how the sensors interpret the data that they collect. And quite a worrying example is now, especially with the apps and Internet of Things, is that there's one example of an app that has got a period tracker, and that basically tells the woman whenever they expect the next period, but the data is automatically sent to Facebook, even if you don't have a Facebook account. In countries like in America, when in some states abortion is illegal, this can be used to track women who might have had an abortion. So we have all those consequences that go from a very basic biology there are very important consequences for women and society. And it's not just about people, it's also about the world that we live in, and especially the impact of climate change. The first figure is a model from the Lancet Countdown study that is looking at the impact of climate change on health. They have produced 31 indicators. Not one of them deals with sex or gender. Okay, so we're talking health. Then we recently we had a speaker at one of the gender summits who deals with marine ecosystems, and they basically recognize that only 4% of studies have looked at the sex of the marine species. It is quite a difficult thing to do, but never mind. You know, the fish and things can be the male, female, or both, and the same applies to different other species. And therefore, when we're trying to predict what will happen to the marine ecosystems and how the different species interact in the future when the acidity of the sea goes up, or the temperatures go up, our models that we have now cannot predict that. Okay? So we might survive as human beings, but the world around us will die. The same applies for the other species. The figure below there shows the different ways that the different species reproduce. So it's very important that they reproduce in a consistent way so the ecosystems, they can survive. These questions have not been even taken into account when people are talking about, the impact of climate change on the world. And the last figure is quite an interesting research idea, is that you can use the cell to monitor pollution and impact of pollution through the whole ecosystem. Unfortunately, in all the studies, the sex of the cell is ignored. So now the last thing is consequences for the bigger world, the Sustainable Development Agenda. There's a SDG 5. It is about empowerment of women. It's good, but it's not really the whole story. The gender research is required for all SDGs, and it's being now ignored. I mean, in other words, there are sustainable development solution networks, which are networks of universities that are supposed to produce research for SDGs, and none of them are reporting or thinking of how to actually incorporate the gender perspective into the research that they are doing. This is a huge opportunity for researchers to deal with. So this is the background from where this session has come. And basically, the idea is that it's equality and quality reinforce each other, they impact on each other. And we know how to deal with that now. Yes, so we really have to deal. We don't need to talk about it anymore, although we're going to talk about it here. But really, the purpose of the session is to help you to recognize that you can actually do something about creating much better science knowledge that will have a better quality of outcomes for women and men. So this is my say, and now I'm going to call on my panel, yes? So all the questions that you will have, please direct them at the panel, not at me, okay? I can answer all the questions, whatever you might have afterwards. It is the panel here that is going to present the really important information. So that's me. Let me just try to get the next one. So I will introduce Professor Astrid Linder, and I really like always to have her on in conferences that I'm on, because she talks about things from the perspective that everybody can understand, even my husband. Okay? So that sets everything absolutely perfectly. So please, this one, the second one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this kind introduction, and good morning, or close to noon. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be here today and to give one of the more details in one of the examples that Elizabeth mentioned here. So it will be about traffic safety. I'm a research director for traffic safety at the Swedish Research Institute, and I'm also a adjunct professor at Chalmers University in Sweden. So let's see here. Yeah. I have a vision that by 2030, the injury protections performances of new car will be assessed for both women and men. And as you understand from this vision, this is not the case currently. I will tell you more about the details and also ensure you that this is realistic. We can do this. We know how to do it, but we need to decide that we're going to do it and take the actions that follow from there. So, first of all, traffic safety, the broader picture. 1.3 million people die on our roads every year. That is equivalent to 250 person every hour, day and night, every day of the year. And in addition to every person killed, we have 10 that are seriously injured, and we have 100 that have what is called minor injuries, injuries that doesn't lead to death or having any risk of you being killed. However, in the minor injuries, we have a lot of those that cause disabilities, lifelong suffering. So this is the total picture, and this is this is a man-made or man and women-made system, and we are in charge of how it's designed and how we can influence these figures. So it doesn't have to be like this. We can have transport without these losses. So, down to some more facts and figures. Here's a busy slide. I will guide you through it. It's about males and females, the number of us killed, the risk or the odds of fatalities and injuries. And this is some of the historical reasons, as I see it, for our focus on males. Because when you count the number, then 75% of the killed are males. That is due to both exposure in terms of more miles driven, but it is also due to higher exposure to risk factors such as speed, driving under the influence of alcohol, not wearing a seatbelt. So this is the figure when you count numbers. As you can see on the references here, in the last decades, we have a number of references showing the risk of injury, given that you have the same crash circumstances. And then the figure is the reverse. You have a higher risk for females than for males. And these references here deals with fatal or severe and fatal injuries. So you can see that that you have both these differences and also that there are similar studies for lower extremity injuries and so on. What is called here severe injuries is on the scale of MIS. This is abbreviated injury scale, which is a scale of risk of death. So this is severe and fatal injuries. The areas where we have the biggest difference between males and females is, however, in another type of injury, and that is the soft tissue neck injuries. Whiplash injuries is the common terminology for this one. Here you can see data from the late 60s and onwards, showing that females have a higher risk of sustaining these injuries. These injuries account for, in the order of 60% of the cost for all personal injuries related to car crashes. So, even more in detail, and here comes the positive message, we can do something about it, as I said. I guide you through this busy slide, but it's an important slide because I want to highlight that we have different innovation out there that can address this issue. However, today we don't have the tools to assess the new vehicles with which of the vehicles that have the best performing systems. Here to your right you see females, and then to the left you have males. And you have the performance of standard seats. And we have two different systems here described, one with an active head restraint and another system with a seat back and seat that absorb the energy. So when we looked at all these systems together, when the in-use statistics told us that we have done something that works really well. We have an increased safety. However, when we divide it up into males and females, you can see for the active head restraint, if there is an effect for females, it's actually negative. So the whole safety benefits are for the males, and they were already better off from the start. And this is what we need to be able to identify when we have new products out on our streets. So, what does it look like in the crash lab? This is a typical picture from the crash lab. You have here average male dummies on their way out on the test track. More in detail, and this is the requirement from the society. The society requires that the cars are, of course, tested and perform according to standards. And in Europe, we have the UNECE standards that we follow. In the US, is FMVSS. Here I have shown you the models that we use in Europe to test our vehicles. First, you have the belt test, and you see the torso, typical male torso here that we use to look at how the belt interacts with the occupant. We have the frontal test with the hybrid 3, the average male, and we have a side impact test with the side impact dummies. And nowhere here do we have the female part of the population represented. These are the models that are available for testing in total. We do have a scaled down male to a small female. She is representing around a 12 to 13 years old person to look at differences in height and weight. In the same way, we also have the scaled up male to what is called the 95th percentile male, and this is then covering the range so that you ensure that the system that you have developed works well for both parts of, for both small and tall, light and heavy. However, as you can see, the female part of the population is still not represented here. So, I talked about how and why we evaluate safety, and of course, as a consumer, you want to be able to pick the best choice. And today, that is not possible from these aspects. In Europe, we have Euro NCAP testing, and there are other consumer information organizations around the world doing testing. And from the society point of view, you want to ensure that the performance is according to our standards. This is one aspect of it. The other one is the legal one. So let me show you what is said in the treaty that is the binding legal document for our society. The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, and rules of law and respect for human rights, including the right of person belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevails. Article 2. In the Article 3, it's stated that the Union shall combat social exclusion and discrimination and shall promote social justice and protection, equality between women and men, solidarity between generations, and protection rights of the child. Reading further, this is Article 8 in the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union. The Union shall, in all its activity, aim to eliminate inequality and promote equality between men and women. The article is addressed to all the institutes of the unions and therefore legally binding at all levels. The article expressed the concept of gender mainstreaming, which is the main strategy for the union to achieve gender equality, meaning that a gender equality perspective shall be applied to all planning policy actions, including legislation and political programs in all areas and at all levels of the union. So you see the gap. And this gap we have tried in a number of projects to address, or I have coordinated the projects. The first one where we did a numerical model of an average male and an average female. There you can see an illustration of the differences in height and weight and geometry. And of course then you have the differences in terms of muscle strength and so on, manifesting itself in the joint properties. And we are continuing this work. I will show you here, there should be animation, but the video didn't make it, so you will have to imagine what happens during the crash. But you can see the initial positions, differences in height, and then, of course, these differences influenced the dynamic response in the crash. We also did a physical scale down male to the properties of an average female. Here they are positioned in the same seat, and you can see, as from the mathematical simulations, the differences in the initial situation, and then, of course, this corresponds to differences in dynamic response. Some examples, let's see, here we are. I often get the question, what is the difference between males and females? Some are geometry, some are strength in terms of muscles, and here are some references, particularly from the neck injury area, where I have been a researcher since the late 90s, and you can see for the neck and the lumbar spine and the motion of the neck, the flexion, extension. And all this then manifests itself, as I said, to the joint properties in the mechanical models that we have. So in conclusion, there's a gap between the aim of the society and how we assess vehicle safety. The men are prioritized, is reflected in regulatory vehicle safety assessment. The average size male represents the whole adult population in regular tests, and injury statistics shows that the protection of women and men is unequal in a crash. I was asked to do some reflections upon this area, so what could be done? And from the World Science Forum and other organizations, I think it's important that the knowledge that we have in science is transferred into society, and finding ways to do that. Actually addressing both females and males, provides better design function for both females and males. So it is an improvement for the whole society. And we need to plan for this. We need to engage in this. We need to set up structure, because if nobody is in charge, if you haven't decided to do it, then it will most likely not happen by itself. So thank you for your attention.
So we're going to keep the questions to afterwards. And now I call, this was a European perspective, and now we need to understand the rest of the world. So we're going to first hear from Aldo Strobel about the National Research Foundation in South Africa and how gender is perceived there.
Esteemed guests, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and Elizabeth, thank you for the invitation. We will indeed change the perspective of the discussion a little bit, and more prominently from the viewpoint of a science granting council, or a so-called funder. Each of your countries have a similar type of organization, and I'm very pleased also to share the panel with our prominent guest from JST, who's our sister organization in Japan. I would also like to recognize my senior colleague from the National Research Foundation, who's here, Dr. Rocky Skiev, who's the Executive Director for Research and Evaluation, and to some extent responsible for many of the aspects that I would like to share with you as we speak today. With your permission, and Elizabeth, I'd actually like to change a little bit the focus of this discussion and rather call it equal opportunities and the gender or diversity dimension in research. So the intent is to describe much more than what our Science Granting Council is doing, but perhaps share with you some perspectives of the development challenges on our continent, Africa, how we regard gender or difference or intersectionality, and then conclude with what specifically the powerful influence that typically science funders have by virtue of funding, to be frank, in how we can address many of these aspects. The comments also relate to a session that we had yesterday on gender equality in science, technology, and innovation, and we discussed it from the perspective of an ethical issue. So let's frame the stark reality of what we are speaking of by using our continent, Africa, as an example. Statistics show that around 54% of women of school age in Africa has never set foot in a school, and that women in Africa represent only 20% of the continent's students in scientific disciplines. While we cannot consider Africa's growth and development without considering the plight of girls and women in terms of further education and training, Africa's human capacity gap is in absolute terms across all genders. This point is made very poignantly by the first woman and the first South African chairperson of the African Union Commission, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, in her remarks, and allow me to quote this. Our higher education has grown, and that's the African continent, at over 16% per year over the last 2 decades, but we still have less than 20% of young African men and women with access to higher and further education. It is only once higher education enrollment reaches massification that we can talk about society striving towards inclusiveness and equity. With less than 20% enrollment in higher education, we are simply reproducing the elite. What compounds this problem is that over 90% of students enrolled in African universities are still in the social sciences. The skill shortage and mismatch, therefore, not only have an impact on growth and development, but also on equity and inclusiveness, end quote. So, colleagues, I think we should take a moment to reflect on this and its implications and what that would mean for our immediate challenges, or indeed our opportunities, which the current conditions present to us as leaders in this room of our various institutions. And this is very pertinent, again, to a so-called funder, many representatives here, our research institutions, our universities, and the networks that we belong to and try to engage in order to advance discussions on these challenges. So, in taking collective responsibility to develop our institutions, we first need to identify some of the gender and equality challenges that face these institutions that all of us belong to. I believe this will help build our institutions that are robust and, perhaps more importantly, fit for purpose. While not attempting to be comprehensive, I want to list a few of these challenges. And I would invite you to contextualize this short list from where many of you come from, developed countries, and where many of us come from, developing countries, and try to gain perspective on if these challenges are commensurate between this so-called developed and developing divide. So the first one is the socioeconomic barriers that lead to the inadequate participation of girls and women in education, and particularly in higher education and STEM specifically. Secondly, the inability of the majority of our young people to access institutions of higher learning. The third one, the fragile state of our higher education institutions, which are, as in South Africa's case, or were designed and built for a select few, but now have to respond to society's demand for more people with higher education training. The fourth one, the relevance of the skills and knowledge that we are able to impart to the young people who enter our institutions of learning. And the fifth one, the frameworks which within knowledge is currently produced and the weakness of our continent's knowledge production capacity. Does these five resonate with you from your perspective? In addition, there also exists extensive research on the importance of considering, promoting, and implementing actions that support equality and equity across the global research landscape. Equal opportunities and diversity in research and research teams allows for the full exploitation of available human capital. Diverse working groups have a positive impact on the quality of research, and it is the key result in a variety of perspectives, experiences, and skills that are contributed in the conduct of this research. Although the advantages of equality and equity in research are widely known, participation of diverse groups of people in the research landscape continues to be a challenge. And you will know the well-known piece of statistics from the UNESCO that only 30% of the science workforce in the world are represented by women. Additionally, Black, minority, and ethnic groups are often underrepresented in the research workforce. In recent years, there's been a growing focus on the so-called intersectionality, not only in social science and qualitative research, but also in how the conduct of research can better advance its consideration, leading to more robust research and research outcomes. So intersectionality, and this was mentioned in our discussions yesterday, is the understanding that social inequalities are mutually constituting. So race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, and age operate not as unitary, mutually exclusive entities, but rather as reciprocally constructive phenomena. In other words, advancing equality and equity has to take into consideration the ways in which multiple elements of identity can lead to different experiences of those that conduct research and in the research outcomes. Although this phenomena and its effect on research funding are increasingly known, data and research on this phenomenon, on intersectionality, in the research context and in research teams is unfortunately scant in Africa. But there's many examples in other countries where this is increasingly includes a focus on research. In Germany, for example, intersectionality, diversity, and related challenges in the research system and the research funding sector has gained a lot of traction. So colleagues, data and experiences on these topics are rare and difficult to determine due to the sensitivity of data and data protection. So public funding agencies, like many of us here, have a catalytic role to play as coordinators of national systems of innovation through our core functions. In some cases, public funding agencies also distribute funds for human capital development, bursaries and scholarships, infrastructure research, etc. And in these roles that they play, can advocate for and implement policies and strategies that support diversity in human capital development and the research that they fund, that we fund. For the research process, this implies careful consideration of how research questions are formulated, how data collection instruments are developed, and more importantly, how research participants are selected. In the African context, a prolific author from Africa has provided some examples of research on indigenous people, agriculture, and sex work that have been undertaken taking in intersectionality into consideration. And they argue, and with great success, that the outcomes present a richer understanding of experiences and of perspectives. Again, colleagues, funding agencies here can have a key role in providing leadership and guidelines prior to and following the awarding of funding. The UK has an excellent example where in 2017, the Equality Challenge Unit produced a guide for the research community on intersectional approaches to equality research and data. In responding to some of these challenges, we, as the National Research Foundation in South Africa, have launched a few key initiatives that I would like to share with you. And this contributes now to the concluding remarks. I think when we speak of transformation, for us at least, it is an all-encompassing term that implies newness, innovation, and certainly transition to inclusivity. In a country like ours, with a history like ours, this is probably the highest endeavor on our agenda. The NRF mandate, indeed, is linked to that of higher educations, where issues such as knowledge production, who produces the knowledge, and what knowledge, and access to that knowledge, all form part of the so-called transformation agenda. So as a result, our role, not only in supporting research, but indeed the role that we play in our national system of innovation, becomes fundamental in our discussions of what transformation and inclusivity means. So we have had a 16% year-on-year increase in the number of women postgraduate students that we fund, and the total now is 8,500 per year. We have a 33% increase in the number of postdoctoral fellows who are women that we fund. We have a peer rating system that's quite competitive and brings into a specific quality framework the research output over years of output that many of our researchers conduct. And we've had an 18% year-on-year increase in the number of women-rated researchers. And our very large South African Research Chairs initiative has seen over the past 3 years a 102% increase in the number of chairs held by women researchers. We try, ladies and gentlemen, but there are many things that are still inadequate, many policies that still need robustness. A second example, and many of your research agencies have this, is what we call customized research grants. and the aim of which is to contribute to the transformation of our entire research landscape in the country. So higher education institutions with low numbers of established researchers that are black or women are the target of these grants, and specifically in our system, what we call historically disadvantaged institutions. So with the university, we identify a cohort of early career academics who are black and female with doctoral degrees to assess their readiness and to provide timelines and a planning framework for a research career. Secondly, a detailed strategy is developed with the university and the incumbent, which recommends interventions for each person and individual and tailored approaches. And thirdly, these institutional interventions are put in place to support early career researchers, and also these interventions that require a whole of institutional approach. Let me be very clear. Many of you from developed countries view the term capacity development or human capital development as a developmental term. In our case, and with many of our partners who understand this, it is for us very equal to the notion of quality. So there's not an inclusive approach to development or career trajectory. It is an inclusive approach where excellence is always the cornerstone of our engagement. In conclusion, colleagues, we've also mentioned yesterday our agency, many of your engagement with the Global Research Council, which is a virtual organization of all the public funding agencies in the world with a massive financial envelope, and that is ascribed now to the principles of enabling women research and enabling agenda for research that is inclusive. This is now truly global. The second part is our formal engagement with 15 countries on the African continent under the framework of the Science Granting Council initiative that has very specific engagements with respect to inclusivity, intersectionality research, and engagement. You will know that South Africa is hosting the World Science Forum in 2021. I will be very loath, to be very frank, if we have the same discussion in 2 years' time that we have had 2 years ago in Jordan, that we have had 2 years ago again in Budapest. I would proclaim, and I think this is what we've been asked for to provide a takeaway, there is time for action and time for implementation. There's a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of experience, there's a lot of guidelines on the table. We have shown progress and robustness, if you will, by strong networks of either science councils or funders, by strong networks of other research laboratories or networks. And certainly, colleagues, I think it is time for us to bring action and to have an innovative discussion on what works in 2 years' time rather than on what is not working. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aldo. So I can't tell you how important it is to have funders to talk like that. It is also beginning to happen in Europe, but to have the funders work together, that's where research will respond to, yes, and the power that the funders have. It's just simply realizing it now. Now, in this room, we have a president of JST, Dr. Hamaguchi, but when I met his predecessor about 4 years ago at the Gender Summit Asia Pacific in Seoul, he said to me, well, you know, the JST is really not such an important funder in Japan. There are bigger ones. But we feel that we have a role to play. We like to throw a pebble into a pond and see what ripples will come out, okay? So now we're going to hear from Dr. Miyako Watanabe what kind of ripples they have produced in Japan.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Elizabeth. So I'd like to talk about the science for societal well-being, focusing on gender bias. So first of all, let me show you why we need social change now, why we need to promote gender equality now. This shows Japan's population, or historical change of population in Japan from 600. The Japanese population increased gradually, but after Meiji era started, our population exploded until recent years. The maximum was at 2008, and more than 10 years passed. But still now, we are almost at the peak, and we will experience a drastic depopulation now. So we have to change our world. The world in the past is quite different from the world, our world in the future. Look at the left figures that show the trend of dependency ratio in Asia. So Japan is the first country to experience shrinking society. But after Japan, Korea, China, and the other countries will follow us. Look at the right figure. European countries are not exception. So this is a common issue in the world. We have to change our world. So shrinking society means an aging society, and we have to depart from mass production, mass consumption, and mass disposal. We have to make a new world. So we should build new society with well-being for all people. So individual person should be admired more. And this concept is very similar to SDGs, so I would like to talk about the SDGs. SDGs are SDGs networks, such as SDSN and the German Foundation, started the annual report, that is the SDG Index and Dashboard report, in 2016. This report describes each country's progress toward achieving SDGs. Japan is over there, and the green bar means a role model, that shows the best achievement so far, and the red bar shows insufficient, that means the worst achievement so far. So let me show you the change of a Japanese performance for SDGs by this annual report from 2016 to the published this year. Japan was always positioned at role model for education. When we see this year's report, only 3 countries among 36 OECD countries are positioned just over here. 3 countries are Canada, Finland, and Japan. Last year, only 2 countries was positioned here. That was just Canada and Japan. So we are proud of our education system from the perspective of SDGs. And if we see the highly insufficient, that means the worst achievement so far, always gender equality, climate actions, and partnerships are positioned over here for Japan. And but if we see the climate action, 31 countries among 36 countries are positioned over here. So most of the countries positioned over here. So this means climate action is a very difficult problem. Of course, we have to do something to achieve it. But anyway, it's very difficult. Similarly, if we see the partnership, 14 countries are positioned over here this year. But if we see gender equality, only 5 countries are positioned just over here. 5 countries are Japan, Korea, Latvia, Turkey, and the United States. So we can say that our most serious problem is gender equality. So we have to change our society now, and we can change gender equality to create a new world. So I will show you some data. We can see the hint to change our society. This shows the economic value of the patent in engineering in Japan. The gray bar shows the economic value of the patent created by male only, and the red bar shows the economic value of the patent by mixed gender teams. The researchers of Development Bank of Japan examined in 2016 first. At that time, the economic value of a mixed gender team was 44% higher. And last year, they examined with the newer data, and they showed the ratio was 54%. That is a very big one. So when we would like to get a higher economic value, we should promote mixed gender teams. So that means promoting gender equality. So next, I'd like to show you very interesting data regarding young people. So this shows a comparison of a science Olympiad and science research presentation winners for high school students. Look at the orange bar. That shows the female ratio of winners of science Olympiad in international Olympiad. And yellow bar shows data for the domestic tournament. Biology and earth science are not so bad, but if we see the other science Olympiad, the female ratio is almost nothing. The total average is less than 10%. But if we see the different perspective, we have a lot of science presentation, science research presentation by high school students. And I show you the 2 science fairs. And green bar shows the awarded winners. So that is different from the competition. That is just presentation fairs. But excellent presenters are awarded by the minister and president of JST by him. And anyway, female ratio is more than 50%. And the GSC, that means the Global Science Campus, that is the top level of the science presentation by high school students. And last week, we had this Global Science Campus fair, and female ratio was 82%. That is very high. So it's very difficult for boys to be awarded in the presentation of their research. So just a competition and just a presentation, very different. So boys win the competition and girls are honored at presentations. So we can see the difference between boys and girls. So next, I'd like to show you the gender gap and the generation gap on female bosses. This was taken in Japan. Look at the left figures. That shows the feeling, age dependence of a feeling of no problem of female bosses. Younger people don't feel much about problem about female bosses, but senior people feel a problem about female bosses. And the broken line shows the data taken 30 years ago, and the straight line shows the data about 3 years ago. So any data got better. So the situation is getting better. But still now, senior people feel the problem about female bosses. Look at the right table. That shows the gender gap and the generation gap between the 20s and 60s. And we can notice generation gap is larger than the gender gap. So if we change the situation of gender gap, so gender equality, we have to think of generation gap. That is very big. So next, I would like to show the one problem. That is about AI. This shows a gender analysis for income and education. Look at the left figures. That shows the female ratio by computer science department in tertiary education in the United States. We didn't have any data in Japan, sorry. So this is the data in the United States. In 2000, the female ratio was about 30%, but it decreased and saturated. And nowadays, the ratio, female ratio is 20%. It's stable now. Look at the right figures. That shows the female ratio by department and salary after graduating the department in the United States. We can see the tendency. If the salary is higher, the female ratio is lower. So that is why the female ratio by computer science department decreased. So next, I'd like to show you the gender balance of investment-related people at venture capital. This is also the data in the United States. So decision maker top venture capital firms, 93% are male decision makers. Female decision makers are very small. And selected investment to founder by venture capital, 85% are male founders. So it is very difficult for female founder to get investment. And similarly, most of our investment were to white people. So we can see men select men. So next, I will show you very good data. This is an organization committee members of this World Science Forum just this World Science Forum. Look at the left one. That is a male and female ratio of organization committee that has a role of a decision of plenary speaker candidate. And 2/3 were female. And look at the steering committee members. 1/3 were female. And that has a role of decision of plenary speakers. As a result, the female ratio and the male ratio of plenary speakers are almost 50%. That's wonderful. So women and men teams select women and men. So this is gender balance of a decision maker. That is quite important. So next, I'd like to show you. Finally, I will mention about the gender bias. So maybe you have experience. You are asked, are colors of the circle the same? And maybe all of you know the colors are just same. It takes a long time, okay? But actually, the colors are the same. But we know the colors are the same. But the colors of two circles look different. So even if we notice the existence of a gender bias, we cannot eliminate gender bias because they look different. So we cannot eliminate any bias. So we should promote diversity with change of our environment. Environment is very important, and decision maker is also very important. So this is my conclusion slide. So gender equality, focusing on women and girls are very important, but that is not isolated. That is connected with ethnicity, men's and boys' problem, race, age, religion, geography, and so on. So these factors are always connected with gender equality. So I think we should promote gender equality with thinking about these relations. So I think that is a shortcut to realize gender equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Watanabe. So we have now just the final speaker on the panel, Magdalena Skipper, who is the editor-in-chief of Nature. I'm so delighted that she could make to this session. And the main reason for me is that there is a shortcut to make an improvement. If the funders and the journal publishers agreed on the same criteria of what is really good research and the criteria of how you judge the gender dimension in research and participation in research, researchers will comply. So we would like now to hear then from about women in publishing. Yes, this is the issue that has been pretty much ignored until very recently because we've been concentrating on women in academia and so on. So now can I welcome Magdalena Skipper.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, and to take part in this fascinating session. Actually, rather than giving my presentation, I would like to engage with the previous speakers in question time, but I guess that will come afterwards. So we heard about sort of what I would categorize as real life. There were very real life examples, and we heard about perspectives from some funders, and actually a very broad context as well. So I will talk a bit about key gender issues and women's issues in science, but through the prism of science communication and that perspective. So I'll start with a bit of history, and you know, this is my indulgence. Nature is 150 years old this year. We just celebrated our 150th anniversary, just the 4th of November. And just to put it in the context for you, obviously a century and a half is a very long time. I came into office as editor-in-chief of Nature last year in the beginning of the summer, so 18 months ago. I am only the 8th editor-in-chief of Nature, and I'm the first woman to hold this post. We have indulged in a bit of gazing into the past, and the reason why I'm bringing this up for you is what I'm showing you here is the masthead of the very first edition of Nature 150 years ago. And what's written on the slide are two versions, almost identical, of our mission statement. It's remarkable, actually, that in 150 years, our statement has hardly changed at all, but I underlined for you a very important change in that statement. So 150 years ago, perhaps not surprisingly, we only talked about the men of science. In fact, the word scientist, although it had already been invented or coined, was essentially not in use at that point. And so indeed, our mission statement talked about the men of science. And very embarrassingly, I will tell you that we only changed that wording in 2007. So today we talk about scientists, of course. And so indeed, our authors, the people we work with, have changed enormously. I'm sure you recognize the gentleman over on your left. Of course, that's Newton, Einstein, and Darwin. And these were the kinds of people who are publishing in our pages. Einstein here is an outlier because he was very young when he came up with his theory, most famous theory of relativity. But most of our authors were indeed old, male, white, and they usually came from a specific socioeconomic background. And so I'm pointing this out because it was mentioned already by previous speakers how these things interconnect. And of course, the women over on your right, scientists, and so indeed, the scientists today come from very different groups of society, different geographies, different ethnicity, and indeed different socioeconomic groups. This was referred to, although nobody actually showed this slide, but this was referred to earlier this is not the most recent statistic, but it shows you a map. Of course, there are some blank regions here. The data are simply missing from this particular figure. But we all know that on average, we talk about 30% of research workforce being made up by women. And of course, that plays out at very different rates in different parts of the world. But it is in this context that I want to continue this presentation. We talk about leaky pipeline when we talk about women in science. We all know that there are many more women who go into studying so-called STEM subjects. But it was mentioned already, the more senior the position is, the fewer women we see. So we talk about this leaky pipeline, and along this figure, this cartoon from a publication of about a year ago from Nature, Ecology and Evolution, you have a number of examples where women fare less well than their male counterparts. And so what's mentioned on here is, of course, being able to graduate and subsequently secure a good position, a research position, to be successful in obtaining funding, also to be successful in securing funds for commercialization of research, and of course in publishing, which publishing of course feeds into many of these aspects. I want to specifically focus on some aspects related to publishing. And these are, I'm really sharing with you some observations as food for thought, hopefully, to stimulate discussion. So one issue that I would invite you to consider is an issue of authorship versus acknowledgement. There have been studies, and this is one example specifically, it was published in bioRxiv a year ago, which was looking at the hidden contribution of women to the foundation of theoretical population genetics. I'm actually a geneticist by training. It was a colleague of mine who pointed me to this particular work. And this was this idea that in the foundational work, when population genetics was beginning to use computer power, many of the women who were developing the programs were not included on the authorship list, but were simply acknowledged in the papers. And of course, so these are the sort of hidden contributions to that research. My second bullet point is an anecdote from a colleague, a fellow editor, who was attending a meeting where quite a lot of proteomics research was being discussed. And it turned out that much of the research, much of the data that contributed to the discussion in the meeting was generated by technical staff, a large proportion of whom were female and never really acknowledged for their contributions in publications, let alone in publications, but also specifically at that meeting. So what does this landscape of female author contributions look like on our journals? This is something that actually we have only systematically begun to look at relatively recently. If anybody submitted these type of data to my journal, I would obviously not look upon it very favorably, so don't take it as statistically significant in any sense at all, but it gives you an indication of the direction in which we are moving. So for those of you who don't regularly look at Nature, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here, so I'm talking about, Nature News and Views, these are commissioned pieces by experts in the field, relatively short overviews of papers that we publish in Nature. Those overviews are put in a context of a field. You can think of them as sort of mini reviews. The opinions which we publish, I don't think need an introduction. That, of course, is as an opinion, a commentary type of style, and then, of course, reviews. So this is commissioned content. This is where the editors, where we can control the authorship of the pieces we publish. So you can see that for Nature News and Views in 2012, only 12% of the authors were female. And what editors tend to focus on when they commission these authors, these pieces, looking for authors who are established and authoritative in those fields. In 2017, this was 26%, and this percentage is growing. For the opinion section, so the opinion section editors have particularly taken that mission to equalize contribution from female authors to heart. As you can see, in 2012, only 19% of our authors were women, and in 2017, 34%, and actually this year, it's going to be more than 50%. That's what it's looking at, like projecting to the end of the year. In the reviews articles that Nature publishes, in 2017, we had 19% of female authors, and I'm ashamed to say we have not improved on that statistic. Nature, Ecology and Evolution, which is a separate journal, has actually taken this mission very much to its heart. And so the editors are very actively, first of all, they're tracking their success, but they're very actively working to achieve parity. And in 2018, in the commissioned content, news and views, 51% of authors were women. And overall, for all of their commissioned content, so reviews and other contributions, it was 34% in 2018. I referred already to our anniversary. For the anniversary, we did a bit of looking back over our history. If you are interested in our history from a number of perspectives, the 6th of November issue has a number of interesting sort of graphical representations of statistics, but for the purpose of this presentation, I just focused on this one. So only a snapshot from our past, so starting from 1980 on this graph to the present, you can see how this is now authorship across the board, across everything that we publish. So original submissions over which, of course, we don't have any control over how the authorship plays out. But that has gone up to 30%, which is an interestingly comparable figure with the percentage of women that we know active in research. Now I'm going to move to talking about all papers. So these are contributions which are submitted to the journals. Nature, Ecology and Evolution. Over on your right, you have geographic distribution in case you're interested, but I'm just going to focus on the left, on the numbers on the left. 23% of submitted manuscripts have female corresponding authors. So these are the senior authors on the papers, right? 22% of these are sent for peer review, and 18% of the published, 22% of papers that are sent for peer review have female corresponding authors, and 18% of published manuscripts, these are original research contributions, have female corresponding authors. As I said already, it's much easier for us to make an influence when we can commission the work. Of course, we don't commission primary research, but this is an example of a journal published by Springer Nature, part of the Nature Research portfolio, called Nature Reviews Disease Primers. This journal was launched in 2015, and the editors have specifically worked to ensure that every paper has at least one female author. They wanted to have overall 1/3 of all authors to be female, and then 1/3 of primers. This is a particular format that they publish in a very graphic way, talking about a specific disease, to be led by female authors. And so the practical statistics are since launch, 94% of the papers received and published collectively have at least one female author, 31% of all their authors are female, and 23% of all primers are led by women. And specifically this year, they say 100% of the papers have at least one female author, 35% of all authors are women, and 27% of the articles were led by women. So what about the reviewers? Because, of course, reviewers influence the publication record, but also being a reviewer is incredibly important from the perspective of your training. So not only do you shape the publication record, but also you can shape and influence your own publication record or your own career. On Nature itself, in 2011, only 12% of our reviewers were women. In 2017, it's 16% of our reviewers who are women. And again, this is something which is not growing as rapidly as we would like it to grow. So this is something we are paying a lot of attention to. Nature, Ecology and Evolution, a journal I showed you some statistics for already. In 2017, 26% of the reviewers were female, and in 2018, 34% were female. Nature Communications, which is similar in nature insofar that it has a multidisciplinary scope, so every area of science and research is in the scope for the journal. As of March 2019, so March this year, 16% of the reviewers were female. For the Nature Reviews journals, so these are the journals where all the content is commissioned. One example I showed you a second ago of a very ambitious journal in terms of proportion of authors, female authors. But on those journals, in terms of reviewers, only 23% of the reviewers are female. So why does it matter that we have gender balance in peer review? Well, the answer is really very similar to what was presented actually just in the presentation before, in terms of, and I'll show you some specific examples in a second, but it's the bias towards favoring the same type of researcher, researcher from the same background. Sometimes it's referred to as homophily, and I will describe that, in fact, illustrate it for you in a second. In fact, it's already mentioned here on the slide. There was a study published in bioRxiv looking at manuscripts that are peer-reviewed and published in eLife. And as it's outlined here, the authors of the study found indeed a homophilic interaction between the demographics of the gatekeepers, so both editors and reviewers, and authors in determining the outcome of peer review. And so the gatekeepers favor manuscripts from authors of the same gender, the same country and region. Keep this in mind, because I will show you the Nature editorial team in a minute, but keep this in mind. Then the authors also found of this particular study that the acceptance rate for manuscripts with male last authors was significantly higher than for female last authors, and this gender inequality was greatest with the team of reviewers was all male. Again, very much echoing the comments that were made by the previous speaker. And that indeed mixed gender gatekeeper teams lead to more equitable peer review outcomes. I don't think any of this is surprising, but it's actually really useful to remind ourselves of it, that what we intuitively find to be true is actually borne out by these numbers. So I will come to a close with a specific example. The example is going to come from work actually done by my colleagues, internal editors on Nature Astronomy and on Nature. It was actually prompted by this paper, which was published in Nature Astronomy by completely unaffiliated authors, which looked at this, aimed to achieve quantitative evaluation of gender bias in astronomical publications from citation counts. And I just pulled out for you one sentence from the abstract of this paper. Here we show that papers authored by women receive 10.4 this amount fewer citations than would be expected if the papers with the same non-gender specific properties were written by men. Quite an interesting study. So what my colleagues did, and this is my colleagues were looking at our own publications. So this is a couple of colleagues, a Nature Astronomy editor and an editor at Nature, looked at manuscripts published between January 2013 and June 2019 in Nature, Nature Astronomy, Nature Geoscience, Nature Physics, so 4 different journals. But these are manuscripts which are specifically in this subject area. So not across, of course, Nature publishes papers in other disciplines, as does Nature Geoscience and Nature Physics, but they looked specifically at manuscripts that fit under these ontology terms: physical sciences, astronomy and planetary science, and earth and environmental sciences and planetary science. And what we were interested in, or what my colleagues were interested in, was indeed looking at possible evidence of bias. So of course we can predict that editors can be choosing which submissions to review or reject because of their gender bias. Editors could be choosing reviewers in a biased way, and then of course reviewers could be recommending whether to accept or reject a manuscript in a biased way. Of course, clearly they should be making all of these recommendations based on the science and evidence itself. So very briefly, a summary of these results. So now just looking at the editor bias. So F obviously stands for female, M for male, U, this is unspecified. So this is gender as assigned to these authors by us. So of course unassigned usually, unfortunately, tends to incorporate authors who come from, for example, Asian countries or sometimes African countries, where for European-based editors, it's difficult to determine gender based on the name of the submitting author. We do not, at submission, we do not collect information about gender on our authors. For Nature itself, you can see that the female senior authors, 57% of those papers were rejected and 43% were sent for review. For male, it's actually much higher rejection rate. I think there's something very interesting going on with the unassigned category, but that is a separate discussion, which I'm open to having. Nature Geoscience has an interesting sort of almost parity there. Nature Astronomy is in the bottom corner. I'm not going to read out the numbers. You can see for yourself. And Nature Physics, again, in the bottom right-hand corner for you. So that's looking at the editor bias. Now, looking at the peer reviewer, slightly more complicated here, because we are overlaying the gender of the reviewers onto this information. So again, the same position of journals, and you can see again female, male, unclassified, female, male, unclassified, but the color grading is showing you the percentage of female reviewers who looked at that particular manuscript. And so in Nature Astronomy, very interestingly, there's a possible suggestion that we're seeing this homophily in the case of female authors, senior authors, when papers are reviewed by essentially all female or close to female reviewers, then most of these papers end up being accepted. Now, it's a fascinating data set which is being explored further. I'm showing you very coarse sort of graphical representation of the first pass of it. But nevertheless, for us, it's really interesting to look at this because, of course, other models to evaluating peer review, such as, for example, double-blinded, so when the reviewers don't know the gender or indeed identity at all of the authors, and sometimes triple-blinded when the editors don't know that either. Of course, that introduces its own complications. So I mentioned to you that I was going to show you the editorial team at Nature, so this is Nature alone. Vast majority of us are female. So bear that in mind when I said how many female authors we commission. We try to commission more female authors, but how many female reviewers we use. And finally, just very quickly, it has not been mentioned, so funding, acquisition of funding has been mentioned, but female recipients of prominent awards, the proportion of them has not been mentioned yet. Of course, this year, I think you've all seen a critique of the Nobel Prize Committee that following last year's much more encouraging numbers, this year we went back to all male winners in all the sciences. We wrote an editorial in which we called for release of the data that the Nobel Committee holds, diversifying the sources for nominations. Of course, the Nobel Committee approaches certain institutions for nominations. We completely informally approached a number of institutions in the Global South, and none of them, the ones we approached, had been contacted by the Nobel Committee, for example. And we called for opening of the archives to learn from the past. There are, of course, prominent awards for women in science in particular. One is the L'Oréal UNESCO for Women in Science International Awards. And there's another award which we set up just a couple of years ago. This year was in its second round, the Nature Research Award for Inspiring Science and Innovating Science. And that's for women alone, for women who are outstanding scientists, but who also promote science amongst girls and young women. And the very final thing I will say is we're actually in the process, so Nature Research also organizes events, conferences. We're in the process of developing a code of conduct for our conferences and expectations of what we would see at Nature conferences. This will be made public very soon. And a few months ago, I'm forgetting exactly when it was, Francis Collins, director of the NIH, made a statement that he would not participate in all-male panels. You may think that coming from me, that statement seems a little hollow, because if I am on a panel, this is no longer a manel, technically speaking. But my interpretation of this is if I am invited to moderate an all-male panel, then that is a manel, and I will not agree to moderate an all-male panel, and I've now made it public. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. So I think you have seen our panel has actually risen to the meaning of the topic. You have had a widespread manifestation of gender bias and the consequences for quality of science. Now, we have started a little late. So can we allow maybe 10 minutes for questions? Because I think there must be quite a few good questions here. So I would invite my panel to sit here. There's never enough time to actually have a really good talk about gender. It doesn't matter how much time we allow, we always need more. So please, who's got the questions to the panel? There are two questions right behind.
Hello, thank you for all the presentations. It was mentioned that in research very often it happens that there are only male research animals used and also cell lines, and I was wondering why this matters, that this is changed, and how we can guarantee that.
I can try and answer some of it as a biologist by training. So historically, in biomedical research, for example, in toxicity testing of drugs, women were excluded from these studies because, so it was claimed, that a woman in reproductive age can never 100% be sure that she may not be pregnant. So that was a historic explanation why essentially all phase 1 clinical trials, so toxicity studies, were done in men, and then subsequently that was easier to recruit them. There was a very interesting comment from you, Elizabeth, that many of the companies which supply cell lines don't supply information about the sex of the cells. It's of course extremely easy to test what origin these cells come from. So somebody called here for collective action, I think it was you, and I think researchers in this room and beyond should actually put pressure on these companies to provide this information, because it's really trivial to test.
Yes, thank you.
Just a question. I wonder, how do you in practice manage? You said that we request, or if I understood you rightly, that each paper should have at least one female author. And I wonder how is it possible to realize such an ideal if you practice double-blinded or triple-blinded evaluations, assessments?
So when I spoke about the desire on some journals to have manuscripts which have at least one female author, that of course spoke specifically to commissioned content, because very, very clearly if you submit your primary work to me, I am in no position to comment on the composition of your authorship and co-authors, because you know who's contributed to the work. So this is for commissioned content. Now, by definition, if we commission content, it cannot be blinded unless it's some other editors who evaluate it. So these are two. When I mentioned the blinding, I simply meant this could be an interesting experiment to do to alleviate any potential bias. It's a complicated situation because there certainly is no homophily, because most editors at Nature are female. On Nature Ecology Evolution, where they have a greater success with identifying female reviewers and also they have a greater proportion of authors, it's also a greater proportion of editors who are female. It's interesting how the proportion of active researchers is different in different fields also. We're very familiar with that. But yeah.
If I may add to that, it doesn't help that we only evaluate the symptom and not the cause. And the cause are that the research teams are by default not constituted in a diverse way. We've, for the past number of years, instituted, especially with cohort model multidisciplinary research calls, that there are quotas or suggestions of what the composition of the research teams must be like. And that, I think, has to a large extent addressed this concern, where rather evaluating the composition ex ante, you do this right from the beginning in a fundamental way. And that again, as Elizabeth has said, I think one must use the power of initial selection to address diversity and be extremely purposeful for it, with it, and not hope that the outcome will be what one wants it to be.
Okay, two more questions.
Hi, I just want to go back to the point about the cell lines and just a personal experience I had recently. And so I wrote a grant and it was about the connection between adipose tissue and cancer. And I chose the model to be breast cancer, since breast is mainly adipose tissue, as a model to begin with. And in the sex gender balance statement within the grant, I wrote that that was the reason why I chose breast cancer. I didn't mean to exclude males. I will try and collect tissue from males if possible, but there's no cell lines available. And in future, I will apply for grants in more male-orientated cancers once I had that. But my grant got rejected from the research office as being biased when they were reviewing it, and I need to rewrite the gender section of it. And I wonder, do we need to have a more pragmatic approach rather than just having a blanket statement within grants to say it has to be gender balanced? And are we starting to stifle research?
So can we have the next question, please? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Rocky from the National Research Foundation. And my comment and question is for Dr. Skipper. And it's informed by the fact that we have similar challenges, and I think we're a little more cautious about this. I found it surprising and sort of interesting that you casually mentioned that from people's names you distinguished gender, and then you went on to extend that to say you're a little more cautious about doing that in Africa and Asia, I think. And by contrast, I would have thought that in Europe you are more liberated in the use of names sort of easily across gender than in Africa. Yet you are comfortable to make that assumption and even come to this podium. I would be very nervous to make those assumptions and come to a podium like this and start playing with and sharing statistics based on assumptions, deductions from names.
Thank you. That's a very, very important criticism of what I showed. Absolutely, these are assumptions. That, you know, when I showed my first slide, in fact, when I showed my very first graph, I said that if this was ever submitted to my journal, I wouldn't take it anywhere, of course. This is an indication. Because we don't collect information on gender in our submission system, we of course have information on geography, right? Clearly affiliation. We don't collect other information. We don't collect information on ethnicity or indeed gender. We wanted to start attacking the problem of clear lack of equality and potential bias. We decided to do it in a very crude way. I completely take your criticism. And in some cases, the unclassified category was indeed larger because we were, if you like, we were more cautious or we were as cautious as we could be. But I take your criticism absolutely. This is not anything that would stand up to scrutiny. We would need to collect the information. And of course, with gender also, an important distinction between sex and gender. With gender also, we would really need to ask how people self-identify. So completely point taken.
Please.
Hello, I'm Dr. Anupama, medical researcher from Medical University of Vienna. I'm more focused on policy issues, so I would like to first make a comment. I have a feeling that when we present problem, we tend to use numbers, but when we're presenting results, we tend to kind of present more positive and success stories. But in terms of a policy or a decision made in a policy framework or legal framework or anything, funding decision, award decisions, we tend not to ask the people who actually did not make it. As a woman, I would like to know why a female scientist could not apply for a particular fund or a fellowship or an award, and so what was the biggest barrier there? Could I request to all of us who were working on this gender bias to kind of make it possible to ask those questions for the female and other gender minority sections? Thank you.
Good idea. I will keep it in mind for the next World Science Forum session. I have a question for Astrid Linder here. Will the crash test dummies become redundant when we have a self-driving cars, i.e. driverless cars?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question, and I would say that crash test dummies as such will be not needed when the injury statistics tells us that we are not injured and killed.
Well, I don't believe the driverless cars will. No, I believe you. I don't believe the driverless cars will actually work in many cities in Europe. In Amsterdam, it's impossible to drive at any case, even so. Sorry, it's a comment here.
This issue of dummies has been publicized for many years. I just can't understand why we can't mobilize so that every car would have a warning in the manual that comes with the car, the publicity material that comes with the car when you're buying the car, that this car has only been tested with this dummy. And therefore, if you're female, you are at risk of X percentage. This is something that we can request and get done as part of the regulation. You could say that vote with your feet, don't buy the cars. But if all cars have that problem, that's not going to help you. But when a manufacturer has to put something which acknowledges a bias on their material, I think that that helps to give them an incentive to change it faster. I mean, it's amazing that it hasn't changed. And you asked, let's focus on the things that work. And we know that, unfortunately, human beings respond to numbers. And so if we have a greater transparency on numbers and we publicize, and for example, in university rankings, we start taking these issues into account, you see that change will be far more rapid. Otherwise, we continue talking. I mean, I've been talking about these things for 30 years. It gets a bit tiring.
Well, that's a very good comment, though, because, you know, we could put this on all the painkillers. These painkillers have been tested on only male rats. Right? So it's a good idea. Let's just do that, yes. Oh, sorry, there's a question there.
Gianna Vellis, Director of ICORSA, International Consortium Research Staff Organization Association. My question is not really a question, it's just an input for Elizabeth and your nice presentation of unconscious biases. Do we need a more gendered innovation where the gender dimension is put in place since the beginning in the conception of a car or a product or a service?
Right, and this is something that the European Commission is strongly trying to promote. It is really quite hard to do. It's quite clearer for medicine and health because there's much more guidelines and so on, but we need guidelines for engineering and also to present the benefits of it, like Miyoko Watanabe was showing the patents. There are many areas which was not, actually people don't even think about it, like hip replacement things. You know, wide hips, the replacement should be like this. Narrow hips, they should be like this. Now, you know, we have to think around it. We were talking earlier, why is a brick the size that it is, okay? When you look at old buildings, they are made up with little bricks. People 500 years ago were much smaller than us. They had smaller hands. They used smaller bricks. Now we have this big man building the things, so the bricks got bigger, cement bags got bigger and heavier. That doesn't have to be like this. So the ergonomics and the opportunities for technological change are all around us. These are opportunities. Women control $24 trillion annually of consumer budget around the world. They are the market. Why is nobody really thinking about them? So I think, yes, so we try to present this as opportunities. So one thing is to improve the knowledge, and the other one is to take the knowledge in order to put it into society. And Miyoko Watanabe would like to comment.
Thank you for your question. So, in Japan, the economic ratio is very high, and most of economy are based on the science and technology and the innovation, and that is just a male-dominated world. And people, most of the people think they can make a good manufacturing a product and software without women, but they don't know the value of a mixed gender team. So we are accumulating a lot of data or mixed gender teams make a wonderful value. And if they know the real value, they can change.
Well, certainly I think we'll have, one more. Okay, last one.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm an astronomer, and I was very interested to see the nature astronomy homophilic interaction contributing positively to the closing the gap in gender balance. And I was interested to see if you have any ideas of why this is happening in astronomy and not in other fields?
We actually didn't compare it with other fields. So we saw it for these papers. We saw it in Nature Astronomy the strongest, but we only looked at really two fields, astronomy and, well, within physical sciences and earth sciences, but looking at astronomy and so planetary science. It will be interesting to compare it with other fields. So there's a comment.
I've been involved in a project funded by the International Science Council, and I was just at a conference where they presented the results looking at just 4 different sciences, but astronomy was one, and it had a much higher increase in the number of women authors because the size of the research teams in astronomy was so much different than, for example, physics or mathematics, where there's still a long tradition of single-author papers. And they were thinking that other sciences that are done in large groups, like environmental sciences as well, that could be an answer. So there'll be a report coming out from this research next month.
Particle physics would be an interesting comparison.
Yes, right. Okay.
And just one more comment on this, because there, like corresponding authors that we don't. There is not that in astronomy. Is it? Could be somehow related, the corresponding authors and the age gap that you have. Maybe the newer generations are a bit better.
Okay, I think we have to stop because Magdalena has got keynote to deliver. So we can't. So I thank my panel.